The political landscape of North America just experienced a seismic shift that no one saw coming. For years, the narrative has been that the United States is the undisputed economic powerhouse, while Canada is the polite, perhaps overly cautious neighbor to the north. But recently, a live television exchange between Canada's newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. Vice President JD Vance turned that entire dynamic upside down. What was supposed to be a standard diplomatic segment on trade relations quickly devolved into what analysts are calling the most explosive transatlantic exchange in a decade. You are watching JohnWillInsight, and today we are breaking down the moment Mark Carney dismantled the American economic narrative on a global stage. The tension started just 30 seconds into the conversation when Vice President JD Vance decided to go off script. Instead of the usual talking points about shared values and border cooperation, Vance delivered a direct, prepared attack. He looked into the camera and declared that Canada's economy was collapsing under socialist policies, calling their GDP growth anemic and their productivity abysmal. He went as far as to label Canada a cautionary tale for what happens when a government prioritizes social safety, nets over economic reality. It was a move designed to humiliate the Canadian leadership and assert American dominance. But it backfired spectacularly because Mark Carney did not flinch. Carney, a man who has governed both the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, sat perfectly still as the attacks came in. When it was his turn to speak, his voice remained measured and professorial. He didn't offer empty political rhetoric. He reached for a folder full of data compiled by his transition team. Carney looked directly at Vance and stated that the vice president's claims weren't just misleading, they were factually incorrect based on the United States' own metrics. This is where the momentum shifted entirely. Carney cited that Canada's economy had actually grown by 2.7% in the last quarter, outperforming the United States' 2.1% growth reported by the U.S. Commerce Department. He then hit back on productivity, noting that Canada's labor productivity had increased by 1.4% year over year, surpassing the 1.1% growth seen in the U.S. according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The exchange moved from trade numbers to the very fabric of society. When Vance doubled down on calling Canadian social programs a failure, Carney delivered a surgical response. He pointed out that despite the socialist label, Canadians live 3 years longer than Americans, on average, while healthcare costs per capita in Canada are less than half of what they are in the U.S. He highlighted that the Canadian education system consistently ranks in the top 5 globally, while the U.S. sits at 27th. Carney's delivery was devoid of emotion or theatrics. He was simply using data as a hammer blow. He argued that on the metrics that matter most to ordinary families, economic security, quality of life, and health, the American narrative of exceptionalism simply isn't supported by the data. One of the most devastating points Carney made involved the concept of the American dream itself. He pointed out that children born into poverty in Canada actually have a 23% higher chance of reaching the middle class than those born into poverty in America. He challenged the vice president by asking a fundamental question. If economic growth doesn't translate into better lives for the majority of citizens, what is the point of that growth? Vance attempted to pivot to the idea of freedom, arguing that Americans prefer the liberty to succeed or fail on their own merit without government interference. However, Carney was ready for that as well, citing international indices that show Canadians actually report higher levels of economic freedom. His logic was simple. When people aren't bankrupted by medical bills or crushed by student debt, they have more real freedom to start businesses and take risks. As the live television feed continued, the atmosphere between the White House and Ottawa shifted from a policy debate into a full-scale ideological war. Vice President JD Vance, visibly flushed and defensive, attempted to reclaim the narrative by accusing Prime Minister Mark Carney of cherry-picking data. Vance argued that the Canadian model was a house of cards, built entirely on the back of the American market and sustained by a tax burden that was driving Canada's best and brightest to move south. This is the moment where part 2 of our analysis begins. As Carney prepared to dismantle the most common myths about the U.S.-Canada relationship, Carney didn't wait for Vance to finish his thought before he began debunking the tax burden argument. He acknowledged that while Canadians do pay higher nominal taxes on average, the total financial burden on a typical family is actually lower in Canada for 90% of the population. He explained that when an American family pays for private health insurance premiums, astronomical deductibles, and saves hundreds of thousands for college tuition, their effective tax is actually far higher than a Canadian who receives those services through their tax base. To Carney, the American system isn't cheaper. It's just privatized, which he argued makes it more expensive for the middle class. Then came the issue of the brain drain. For decades, American politicians have claimed that Canada's high-skilled workers flee to the U.S. for better opportunities. Carney pulled out another set of documents and stated that this trend has actually reversed. In recent years, net migration between the two countries has shifted. More Americans, specifically those in tech, healthcare, and education, are seeking residency in Canada. They aren't just looking for jobs. They are citing the quality of life, the safety of their children in schools, and the lack of medical bankruptcy as their primary reasons for relocating. This was a direct hit to the idea of American exceptionalism, suggesting that the American dream might actually be moving north of the border. The conversation then turned to the most sensitive topic of all, trade dependence. Vance asserted that the Canadian economy depends entirely on access to American markets, implying that Canada should be grateful and compliant. Carney's response was a masterclass in economic diplomacy. He corrected the vice president, stating that the relationship isn't one of dependence, but of interdependence. He pointed out that 40% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are actually part of integrated supply chains. This means that American products, cars, planes, and machinery cannot be built without Canadian parts. A trade war wouldn't just hurt Canada. It would paralyze American manufacturing and send inflation through the roof. For the American consumer, Carney's message was clear. If you try to burn our house down, yours will catch fire too. The interview reached its final minutes. The social media world was already in a frenzy. Clips of Carney's calm, data-driven responses were being shared by the millions. The hashtag Carney vs. Vance began trending globally. In Washington, the White House press office was forced to issue a terse statement. But observers noted they didn't dispute a single one of Carney's data points. Meanwhile, in Canada, the reaction was nothing short of euphoric. For the first time in a generation, a Canadian leader had stood on the world stage and refused to be bullied, using logic and facts as a shield against ideological bluster. But why does this matter to you, the viewer? This exchange represents a fundamental fork in the road for Western democracies. It asks the question, should the goal of a nation be to maximize the wealth of the top 1% and the raw power of the military? Or should it be to ensure that the average citizen can live a long, healthy and educated life? Carney's victory in this debate wasn't just about winning a TV segment. It was about proving that a caring economy can also be a competitive economy. He showed that you don't have to choose between growth and equity. You can have both if you have the courage to invest in your people. As we conclude this special report on JohnWillInsight, the fallout continues to ripple through the halls of power in D.C. and Ottawa. JD Vance walked into that interview expecting an easy political win, but he left having his entire worldview challenged by a man who brought a spreadsheet to a knife fight. This was a reminder to every politician who trades in empty rhetoric. In the age of instant information, the person with the best data usually wins. Mark Carney didn't just defend Canada. He set a new standard for how leaders should talk to one another, with facts, with precision, and with an unwavering focus on the truth. The stakes are too high for anything less. This isn't just about Canada versus the USA. It's about the future of how we govern ourselves in the 21st century. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive analysis. If you found this insight valuable, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Do you think the American model is still the gold standard, or has Canada found a better way? This is John Will, and I'll see you in the next one.